thanks very much for inviting me. It has been super interesting seminar series so far. Today, I would like to present my work on migrants' missing votes, which is joint work with Felicitas Sikora from DIW. The main story of this paper is that countries that experience large outmigration, and when outmigration is concerning a very particular and selected type of the population, this can have effects on voting in the origin country. And we will study it in the case of Poland. So let me start with a little anecdote that shows you why migrants missing votes is important. So in 2020, you might have read about it in the news. There was a very tight election in Poland between the populist right-wing candidate Duda and the opposition candidate. And the populist right-wing candidate won, but at a very narrow margin, with 51% and barely 500,000 votes difference. So this is interesting because among the Polish diaspora, the opposition would have won by a large margin. But the problem, so to say, is that the turnaround or the turnout of the diaspora was very low. It was only 10%. That's around 400,000 votes because of around 4 million emigrants are living abroad, Polish emigrants. So why do I tell you the story? I tell you the story because had the turnout among the diaspora been a little bit higher or close to the one of voters in Poland, the opposition would have won. So this is just an anecdote that shows you that migrants missing votes can actually matter in turnaround elections. So this is just an example, and it also rests on a couple of assumptions. So let me give you a little bit of broader motivation. Around 3.5% of the world population are migrants. I don't have to tell you much about this in the seminar, but emigrants are less likely to participate in elections in their home countries. And there are a number of different reasons. Maybe they're not interested enough. Maybe the hurdles for voting are very high. But in generally, and in particular in Poland, you can see that while in Poland, turnaround has been around 50%, slightly increasing over time. In the other main destinations, it barely reaches 10%. In Germany, it barely reaches 5%. So this would not be a huge problem if the migrants were not a highly selected group of people. So in the case of Poland, but also in many other countries, we can see that emigrants are highly selected. For example, in Poland, if you look at political preferences, you can see the upper share is the right-wing votes. And you can see that in Poland, compared to abroad, the number of people that vote for right-wing parties, it's much lower. It doesn't matter that much for left-wing votes, but for right-wing votes, it actually matters a lot. So it seems that people that are emigrating have different political preferences. Now, this could be because they had different political preferences before migrating or after migrating. That we don't really study this part, but it just shows you that the missing votes are not a representative type of votes. And this could also be linked to the fact that migrants are selected on age, gender, education. For education, it's very clear. So only around 20% of Polish people, it has been increasing over time, but roughly have tertiary education. Whereas if you look at emigrants, it has been more than 40%, recently declining, but still more than 30%. So differently educated people vote differently, different age structure of people vote differently. But I think this is to show you that those that emigrate vote differently than those that are left behind. And then, of course, if those that emigrate are also less likely to vote, this has effects on voting results back home. So our research question is, what are the consequences of high emigration rates on election results in the country of origin? What we do exactly in a nutshell? So we try to get at the causal effects of emigration on electoral outcomes in Poland from 2004 to 2019. And we look at both national parliamentary elections and European parliamentary elections. Why do we focus on Poland? This has two main reasons. The first is that it's well suited because it had experienced substantial emigration, especially after the accession to the EU. I guess this is also common knowledge, but you can see that emigration from Poland, especially in 2004, etc., to the UK, but later to Germany, has increased a lot. Here you can see the stocks has been much stronger than the stock of immigrants, which has also been increasing, especially because of the conflict in Ukraine, but is much lower. So Polish people, if you ask them in a survey what are they concerned about, they're more concerned about emigration than immigration. And on the right-hand side, you can see the flows and you can see the spikes, especially after the EU accession. Has been declining a bit also because of the financial crisis and better opportunities at home, but in general, the flows have been increasing. The other reason why we study Poland and not other countries that experienced large outmigration is that we get emigration data yearly at the county level. This is actually quite rare. Emigration data in general is quite hard to get. Many times it's proxied by immigration in the destination countries, but then it's never at the county level in the country of origin. So in the case of Poland, they have a system where you have to deregister your permanent departure. And this is done at the county level. So we can see at the county level in every year, the amount of people that register their permanent departure. Then, of course, emigration, I mean, it's always the same in migration, is endogenous and there's many problems. So we build on the very basic idea that distance to the border matters, but then we try to extend it and make it a bit more relevant by including the distance to the nearest open border. And with open, we mean open labor markets, and the labor markets have opened in 2004 for certain European countries and in 2011 for the latest countries, namely Germany. And also we think that with time, airports become more important, and especially to the UK and Ireland, airports are important. So we also include the distance to the nearest international airport. All these Ryanair and Wizz Air, etc. I think they are quite important as well. So that's how we extend the basic distance instrument. More details, of course, are coming in a bit. And a preview of our results. So we use administrative migration and administrative voting data at the county level. And we show that larger immigration rates increase the vote share of right-wing parties and decrease the vote share of left-wing parties. That's our main and basic result. And then we look at a couple of other outcomes. We were very interested in pro-European positions and voting for parties that are more pro-European. And we find positive effects. So larger immigration leads to larger voting for pro-European parties. And larger immigration rates also reduce trust in the right-wing government, while it increases trust in left-wing government. So this trust issue is basically the same as the voting pattern. It's just interesting because it's a completely different data set. We don't use the instrument and we still get very similar results. And to get at the mechanism and to show that it's really about missing votes, we use heterogeneity over time because voting from abroad has become easier over time. especially with the introduction of postal votings, but also because more and more consulates or places, polling stations abroad have been implemented. And we find that the results are mostly driven for the earlier time period, so the 2000s, where voting from abroad was really hard and you needed to travel to the closest embassy, which could have been a couple of hours away. And we consider this as evidence that it's about missing votes and not the kind of other transmission mechanisms, but I'm speaking about this in more detail then. So we are not the first to generally be interested in the topic of emigration and political effects abroad. At home, there is a larger literature that focuses on democratization. So there's the paper by Basbai with Andreas, who's the speaker next week, and Hillel Rapoport on Moldova. And they find that more emigration increases democratization. And this is mostly due to transfer of values, of the democratic values from the emigrants back to the people left behind. And there are a couple of other studies cross-country about Mali, about Cape Verde, about Mexico, that shows that actually emigration improves democratization and that emigrants play an important role in bringing these democratic values back home. This is mostly from developing countries to developed countries and about democratization for countries that could be considered not yet democratic. Our setting is a bit different, and the most related paper in that respect is on Italy by Anelli and Perry. And it's the most related in the sense that it's also a European Union country where it's mostly about migration from the European Union to other European Union countries where you could consider the culture is similar and it's a democratic origin country already. And they find evidence of the so-called exit effect that was termed by Hirschman. That means basically that if the liberal-minded or opposition people are emigrated because they are not happy about the government, then these people are missing in driving political change back home. And what Anelli and Perry are looking at as the characteristics of the people. And they basically say that if the young, well-educated female people are leaving, then these people don't become politicians back home because they have emigrated. And this creates a problem for political change back home. And it reduces the political dynamism. So in comparison with them, we focus on parliamentary elections and voting outcomes rather than personal characteristics. And we also have a bit of different settings because the people in Italy, they emigrated during the financial crisis. That's the exogenous shock they are using. And they might be very differently selected than the ones from Poland, which didn't really migrate out of necessity, but more of opportunity. The paper is also broadly related to the transmission of knowledge and values because, of course, the voting of those left behind is influenced by their values and their knowledge, which is transferred by the emigrants. And this is, again, the Moldova paper, which shows this very nicely, but also previous work I've done on knowledge remittances in East Europe, but also Sulin's work with Hillel is very related to that. So let me briefly give you a bit of an institutional background. It's not completely different than Germany. So you can vote if you're above 18. The legislative power is elected every 4 years. There's a parliament with around 460 deputies. You have to reach a threshold of 5%. The party has to reach 5% of votes to be in the parliament. It's 8% if we are talking about coalitions. And this is pretty straightforward, I would say, and we use these parliamentary election outcomes. At the same time, since 2004, we used European parliamentary elections. So how does voting from abroad work? Very briefly, it used to be the case that you had to actually go to the Polish consulate or embassy in your country. There are also specific polling stations you need to register before. So this comes with a significant cost, both in administrative terms, but also in effort to actually reach the place. Then at some point they introduced the postal vote, so it was made easier, but it's still not 100% compared to voting in Poland, because sometimes the postal votes don't arrive. There's lots of anecdotal evidence that voting from abroad is still much harder than voting in Poland. Briefly on our data sets, it's pretty straightforward. It's admin data, emigration at the county level from Statistics Poland. What is important to note is that this is only permanent international migrants, and permanent is more than 12 months. Temporary migration in Poland is much larger, but we don't have this data at the county level because you don't have to deregister yourself in your county if it's less than 12 months. Data on electoral results are also pretty straightforward. Official electoral results at the county level. We only consider parties that made the threshold. And what is a bit more interesting is how do we classify them? And there's the political science that is doing that work for us. There's different classification schemes. The one we use in the baseline is called Comparative Political Dataset by Armin Guillon. And they classify all parties in many different countries in many different years according to a right, middle, left scheme. Yeah, if I have time in the end, I can show the details. For robustness, we also consider other classification systems because, of course, we don't want our results to be based on a certain classification. So there's also these alternative data sets, for example, Parliament Government Compositional Database and Chapel Hill Expert Surveys. The Chapel Hill Expert Surveys, they tell you which party is pro-European according to an expert survey. So that's quite nice as well. We have an alternative outcome. We don't want to rely on voting only, which is trust in the government. And here we use the Life and Transition Survey, which is done by EBRD. And the main advantage of this compared to something like European Value Survey is that it's available at the county level and representative at the county level. And then we have a couple of controls, unemployment, GDP, wages, etc. from Statistics Poland. The identification strategy, so we basically relate the people that emigrate at the county level in the 4 years before the election, so between the previous election and the election now, to voting for the right wing or the left wing in a specific year in a specific county. We then instrument the emigration with a dynamic IV, which is the distance to the nearest open border or international airport. The controls, you will see them later, the standard controls. We also control for education. We control for industry structure, share of female. So a couple of county level controls you think would influence election and emigration. We have time effects, we have state effects. So let me give you more details on the instrument. So the first stage relates the distance to the emigration, and it's quite strong. So you can either use distance in kilometers or duration in hours. We mostly use duration in hours because it has the stronger F-stat. But in a robustness check, we show distance in kilometers. And there's a really nice data command that calculates the duration in hours if you put in the geocodes. To ensure that there's no direct link between the instrument and voting outcomes, I mean, counties at the border could be different from other counties. We control for a large set of variables. We have state fixed effects, and we do some robustness checks, for example, matching counties that are close and do a matching exercise. So just to show you the borders of Poland and which ones are open and closed. So the borders that never close, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, they never open. They are always closed. Then Denmark or Sweden, I mean, it's a sea border. It can be also airports, the border in the upper part. Lithuania, Slovakia, Czech Republic open in 2004. What is also important to note is that just behind Czech Republic and Slovakia, there's Vienna. So many people didn't really go to Czech Republic, Slovakia, but to Vienna. And Germany opens in 2011. So I'm already coming to the main results. Here you can see in the very top line, log emigration per county and how it's related to the share of right-wing voting with different kinds of fixed effects. But the baseline and the basic result is that no matter how exactly we define the fixed effects, if they're state times time or just state and time, the results are pretty robust. And this would show you that a 1% increase in emigration at the county in the 4 years preceding the election leads to a roughly 0.25% increase in the share of right-wing votes. Whereas it's roughly 60% of people who vote for right-wings on total. We found pretty much the opposite for left-wing votes, slightly larger coefficient, but not always as robust as the right-wing results, slightly less statistically significant, but it's basically showing you that the right-wing parties gain at the expense of the left-wing, and the central parties don't show much results. So what we found super interesting is also the attitudes toward Europe. And this is not directly related to left or right-wing parties, because there's right-wing parties that are pro-European and there's right-wing parties that are Eurosceptic. For example, the PES that is currently in government is very Eurosceptic. And then the PUE O party that is also considered a right-wing party is very pro-European. The same for left-wing parties. So it doesn't fit in the same scheme that left and right-wing parties. And our initial idea and what we've thought is a very interesting story is that it's basically pro-Europeans that emigrate. And then it should be the anti-Europeans that are left behind, and then anti-European voting would increase. That was our hypothesis. We found the opposite. We found that more emigration leads to stronger voting for pro-European parties. And then we had to come up with a couple of explanations for this. So I think the most likely explanation is that counties with a large emigration also have a large intention to emigrate. And they also have large remittances. And they also have positive wage effects because the labor supply decreases. So these people are actually in many ways either benefiting from emigration or planning migration, or maybe there is more temporary migration as well. So that's why the left behind also vote more pro-European, which is a positive side effect, even though it was a bit unexpected. Now, if you don't like our voting data, or if you don't like our IV, we can go to a completely different data set and a slightly different methodology. And we look at trust in the government from the Life in Transition survey. The nice thing here is that we have trust in people and then also trust in different aspects of government, parliament, president, courts, parties. And the interesting thing is that in 2006, when the survey was done the first time, there was a more left-leaning government, and trust in government, parliament, parties was reduced, exactly in line with our voting results. In 2010, when there was a more center government, we don't find significant results. And in 2016, when the PES was in government, so populist right wing, we find that trust in government increases. And this is exactly in line with our voting results, because those that did trust in the government are staying behind, and those that didn't trust in the government are leaving. And then there's this missing, not missing votes, but missing trust. And you can see in panel A that this is not about trust in general, because trust in people didn't change. So it's really about the government and the parties. And you can see that courts are also not really independent of the government, apparently. So we have done some heterogeneity analysis. We can split by national parliament and European parliament, and the results are stronger for the national parliament. We can check Western and Eastern Poland, there's not large effects. And then we can check if the results are different over time. And you can see that it's actually, no, this is the national versus European parliament, this is East versus West Poland, and this is over time. And you can see that the effects are driven by pre-2014. And in this time, voting by post was not possible. So it was much harder for people abroad to vote. So we would assume there's more missing votes, and that's why the effects are larger. So this is nice evidence, we think, for the channel being more about missing votes than about transfers, cultural, financial, or knowledge transfers, because we wouldn't expect such a strong break in 2014. We've done a number of robustness checks. I keep it brief. I think I have like 2-3 minutes left. We can do not the dynamic version of the instrument, but a static version where it's just closeness to the border. That was our very first estimation strategy that works. We can use distance or duration. We can drop the airports. We can include or exclude border crossings to non-EU countries. We can change from stocks to flows. We can do shares of emigrants or total amount of emigrants. We can fix the covariates at a pre-EU accession level, because you might be worried that these are bad controls. We can use a different party classification from another political source. We can match counties that are more similar in observables and only compare counties with a common support. We would just follow Dustman here. And instead of using the previous 4 years, we can use the previous 3 years plus the actual year of the election, because of course the election doesn't take place on 1st of January. So let me conclude. We find that as a result of emigration, voting for right-wing parties increase, because those that emigrate are more likely to vote left-wing, and then those votes are missing. Trust in right-wing governments is equally affected. So trust in right-wing governments increase if more people are emigrating. Results are driven by earlier time periods, which we think is some evidence that it's really about missing votes and not about other types of transmission mechanisms. But I also want to say here that I'm not claiming there is no knowledge transfers, that there's no cultural transfers. Of course there is, and I know all the papers and I have my own paper on that. But I think that in this context where the culture is similar and where we already have democratic institutions, the most important factor, or very important factor, is about really this more technical factor that the votes are simply missing. So immigrants can be a decisive factor in electoral outcomes, as I've shown you in the very beginning in my example about the presidential elections 2020. And one policy implications could be that voting should be facilitated for citizens abroad. There has been lots of anecdotes in the Polish media that in 2020, the government, who knew that the opposition, that the diaspora is voting for the opposition, made it particularly hard for the diaspora to vote. There have been a lot of court complaints. And of course, the government doesn't always have incentives to facilitate voting for the diaspora if they know that the diaspora is voting against them. So there should be probably something beyond the government deciding, but maybe at the EU level, some decisions that voting should be facilitated for citizens abroad. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm looking forward to your comments.